Hello everyone, this is Philosophy of the People with Stefan Bertram, and today we will be discussing eating meat, and specifically the idea, we're going through quite a few ideas, but kind of a central pillar of what we'll be discussing today is the idea is that it may be possible to justify eating meat. It is probably much easier to justify vegetarianism, but what is certainly completely unjustifiable is our current account of morality along animals, where there's basically like arbitrary distinctions made where certain animals are like it would be terrible and horrible to kill them, but animals which are more intelligent than those animals and have much more capacities for complex pain and grief and so on are very easily slaughtered. I would also say that I'm going to be trying well, not a different format, a return to a previous format where I am reading off a prepared script, but I will not be showing it on screen. It's not on the form of a PowerPoint, because while I think the PowerPoint is more informational, that is a word, isn't it? Informative. I don't think it looks good. So obviously there are ways to make something like a PowerPoint look better, but I think one significant problem is I'm not doing that. And a second significant problem is that StreamYard isn't really built for that, where the options for the size of me and the size of the screen and so on don't really go very well together. Among ordinary people, meat eating and other activities that are premised on the killing of animals are regarded as easily justified. Though if you ask people what their reasons were here, you would generally get a great deal of nonsense, a lot of contradictory ideas that fall apart under the easiest amount of scrutiny. This doesn't necessarily prove much, because there's lots of people who believe lots of things which are right or seemingly right or whatever, who nonetheless could not think of a single good argument for why they're correct on the matter. Presumably, in the kind of atheist, theist debate, and including all of the possible factions, there are some people involved in that debate who are right, but that doesn't mean that any of them know what they're talking about. But I think this is especially sharp in the case of people who eat meat and view the eating of meat as justified. In order to justify eating meat, you need to abandon various normal points of view to make sense of the position. It would involve abandoning any attempt to claim general moral concern for household pets, for instance, and also to engage in a difficult retreat on the topic of young babies and certain classes of the severely disabled. This is a retreat which someone like Peter Singer, I wouldn't say he happily did, but something he was brave enough to do, while at the same time committing also to vegetarianism on a certain account of the rights of animals. The common position around eating meat, around the rights of animals and the killing of animals and so on, I think could best be understood as working on a sort of friend, enemy, and then prey distinction. These do not necessarily follow species lines, though they do broadly. There are friend animals. These animals may be personal companions or may work in specialized roles. For instance, barn cats. Everyone loves a barn cat, even if they're like fundamentally not pleasant to be around often. But they do a good function and they resemble house cats and, people like that. For friend animals, we view these animals as not just deserving of life themselves, but we view it as right to kill other animals for their sake. This is often the case because most friend animals are omnivores, or in case of cats, quite leaning heavily towards being carnivores. But also we view it as fine to kill. Like if an animal is fighting our animal, it's right to kill the animal which is attacking our animal. Then there are enemy animals. classification which used to matter a lot more in the world, and still matters in some very, very deprived parts of the world, who present a threat to humans and their friend animals and can be rightfully killed without hesitation. Notably, it used to be the case that animals which presented such a threat to property were also counted here, but in the West, or at least in Britain, this has changed. It's no longer really seen as justifiable to kill an animal, especially a cute animal, for the sake of defending property. So there's a great deal of disdain among most of the public in Great Britain as regarding the killing of foxes, for instance, even if they are a threat to property. And it's also possible for a friend animal to become an enemy animal. See, pit bulls. At the point where these horrible dogs start the killing, they transition from being friend animals to enemy animals, and there's very little objection to their killing. Then there are prey animals who are not a threat, but still exist in order to die. They were mostly raised by humans, often with the collaboration of certain friend animals, for instance, herding dogs. But they exist to die, mostly for the sake of humans, but also for the sake of friend animals. And also in this category, we could likely include pests, rats, and so on, within a very similar category, even if their use is not a direct one. Rather, they're killed for the sake of allowing other things to flow. Fourth class of animal. We could also create a fourth class of other animals who have variable status, from lions to blackbirds, but these rest at the edge of our animal consciousness for most parts. Janos says, the thing I've been saying forever is the only consistent veganism is anti-capitalism and vice versa. Any serious anti-capitalism has serious implications for our relation to the non-human world. I'm not sure the relationship goes both ways in the same way, but we will discuss later how, while there may be a possible justification for the continuation of animal agriculture, even on a relatively decent scheme of animal rights, it's certainly not one that's compatible with capitalism, where in capitalism, it's not just the animals which are unjustifiably exploited in the production of food, but it's also the humans who are more often than not exploited. Soon says rabbits are enemy animals; they destroy crops. And yeah, I mean, I think rabbits is probably even a better example than foxes, where rabbits can be destructive to human crops, but they are regarded as also completely harmless and very cute. And so people are increasingly objecting to the idea that we should be allowed to freely kill rabbits. And of course, there's the fact that rabbits are also domesticated as pets. Like probably, I don't know, I'm not sure what the ratio of free rabbit is to a captive rabbit. But there's no real moral backing to the sort of schema I produced here. Like, it is a schema. It is how people often think about things. But it does not one that is actually justified in a reasonable way. These animals can't have inherent value based on their nature because that does not feature in this system. Killing a prey pig may be theft, but killing a friend pig, if it's kept in a house, is a deep moral offense. There's no distinction here made about these kinds of pig. They're the same pig. The actual distinction is just how the human treats it. It's purely for the sake of the human and their relationship to it. There's no inherent right here for the animal at all. What is notable here is that people do not view this worth, however, as purely an instrumental one. People don't think that cats are valuable because cats are a friend animal, but rather there's something inherently about the cat that makes it a friend and valuable. So if we imagine that there is a cat which no one values as a friend, but is the right sort of cat, we still think it's bad to harm it. In fact, we probably think it's even worse. Like if I make you think about this nice cat which no one is friends with, and then ask you to imagine someone harming it, you're like, oh no, that's even worse than if an unassociated or a cat with a great deal of friends was harmed. Sam Badger said domestication could be reinterpreted as a kind of bizarre mutualism. We protect them from other predators and get a monopoly on their predation. Problem is, capitalism abuses that logic. It's interesting as regarding cows and sheep and chickens and so on, because while we may, if we commit ourselves to the abolition of human agriculture, it would also mean a massive decline in the number of these animals that exist in the world, which is interesting. I think is fine. I don't really have an objection to that. But I think if you're some sort of anti-speciesist vegan, you have a tension here. That's the point I'm making. A post-capitalist society lays a material foundation for doing away with the human and non-human exploitation that wouldn't be possible, say, in a pre-capitalist society. Yeah, certainly. So you imagine kind of vegan medievalism would have just mostly been leaving animals alone, as opposed to the interventions I'm going to talk about later. No Name says that anti-capitalist position doesn't imply that humans cease all metabolic interactions towards non-humans. Yeah, I think that's completely true. I think it's important. I think something which isn't intellectually, I think we're all too intersectional these days. We try and like connect up all positions, but I've much more of the old-fashioned view that you can have these kind of mutually independent positions which don't necessarily overlap each other. And we should view justification more in particular terms than generalized ones. What reasons could there be for valuing certain animals over others? Intelligence, or whatever sort of word you want to use for their general kind of mental, intellectual capacity, I would say is the only reasonable suggestion here. The most theoretically sound position, if it could be justified, is the notion that certain animals are deserving of rights because they experience pain, and they experience this pain reflexively or reflectively, or whatever account you prefer here. I mean, in the sense that there's a difference, we might think, between pain which is felt just by a simple mind, where it's like, oof, compared to a mind which can reflect upon its own pain. We might think that the second kind, this like second order kind of pain, is either the sort of pain which is morally relevant, like pain that a mind that can reflect upon its own suffering is the sort of mind that's morally relevant. Or we may think that the second kind of mind is at least one which is much more morally relevant, or more relevant in a more substantive way. If you can't kind of reflect on your own pain, then only what happens to you in the kind of moment to moment is something which matters, and past events are more easily forgotten. But any account like this, while allowing us to make distinctions between certain kinds of animals, doesn't help defend the normal kind of situation around eating animals, because it doesn't line up in the way that any normal person would wish it to. It's not that pigs are dumb. And dogs and cats are not the highest animal. They're not even the highest among the animals in question. The evidence marking out pigs as being more intelligent in various ways. Dogs are variable in this account, though there's also a struggle to distinguish how intelligent dogs are, because they have the advantage of being the most biddable of all animals. In some ways, they don't need to be smart enough to work out what the human wants, because they've kind of, it's been drilled into them for 10,000 years exactly what humans want. And they show that, cats, probably on some kind of deep in their blood, they know what humans want, but aren't biddable in the same way, and so they just don't do it, even if they may recognize it in some deep animal sense what that is. If you make a narrow distinction, you exclude animals you wish to include, and if you are broad, you include many animals. You have a low standard of intelligence and ability to reflect on pain, and then you end up not being able to eat meat. You can only eat bugs. You can only eat bugs, and I've heard people really don't like when people tell them to eat bugs. So the other plausible account, which could see us still eating meat, and one that I've mentioned already, is the idea that animals having rights is compatible with us slaughtering them. This would require radical changes to animal agriculture as it currently exists, but assuming these rights are not so strong or broad, it's at least possible to consider. But this would require a retreat on various other notions. For instance, it would be allowed to kill and eat dogs and cats after giving them a pleasant life. Though this doesn't necessarily mean much, it doesn't have this kind of shocking moral conclusion for ordinary people if we're trying to sufficiently reconcile common perception with what is right. This doesn't have necessarily massively shocking things, because there are things that people could do to their dogs and cats which would be permitted or illegal, which people nevertheless don't do. So we could say, oh yeah, it is legal to kill and eat your dog or cat at the end of their pleasant life, but if no one's interested in taking that up, it doesn't really matter. But of course, this kind of nice animal agriculture, is not one that's possible in capitalism for the reasons I've already mentioned. And this is one for, well, maybe during socialism. As I've mentioned, under capitalism, it's necessary to put humans through immoral conditions for sake of profit. There is zero chance of being able to free animals from these conditions, though, of course, we would still say that the conditions under which we're abusing or exploiting animals are lower than the ones we're exploiting humans. Sam Badger in the chat is discussing that there is a North American indigenous tradition of cooking grasshoppers, which makes them very tasty. I would say I have not eaten the bug, but I would like to eat the bug. I'm interested in eating the bug, but it's not really something which exists in the UK or anywhere I've lived before. Animal agriculture as it presently exists is, to put it lightly, far from ideal. If you assign any value to the sort of animals that are mass produced here, it's far and away the worst thing going on in the world. Whether you do or not, it's clear that meat eating is not defensible without large modifications to common sense. Chris Olsen said, I ate fried beetles in Thailand. I've been to Thailand, but I was too young and lacking in exploratory spirit when I went there, so I didn't eat the bugs. Ah, that's interesting. Sam's suggesting that they get the grasshoppers while they're harvesting corn. How many limbs of moral common sense must be cut off for meat eating to make sense? Well, there's no justification for certain animals being friends beyond personal statements and the bonds between humans. If we go with a standard of saying these animals aren't morally relevant, we would have to abandon the idea that it's wrong to kill a dog for the sake of the dog, and say it can only be wrong for the sake of that dog's relations to humans. The retreat on the disabled and babies is going to be even harder than giving up the moral value of these pets. This, to be clear, I don't think I've actually said this in the essay, as if I was expecting everyone to know this kind of insane conclusion. But if you read someone like Singer, we realize that if we want to make a distinction quite high in terms of saying humans are morally variable, but most or nearly all other animals aren't, then there are certain humans who don't have the things that we think would mark out humans in terms of very high kind of we're very self-aware, we're very conscious, we can do meta reflections on our pain or on our podcast or whatever. But not all humans share these features. For instance, very young babies don't. And certain classes of disabled humans, though it's probably, in the case of the disabled, it's far less than people think it is. We're talking about very, very few people here. Like Down syndrome, people with Down syndrome are still more intelligent and more self-reflective and so on and so forth than any species of animal on the earth. But of course, very reasonably, people don't want to treat the disabled and don't want to treat babies worse than we presently do. The instinct to protect babies is probably quite strongly wired in us, and babies are very obviously cute, vulnerable creatures that grow into the only thing that humans really value. As for the disabled, it hardly seems that we need to further devalue them. This is especially the case these days, where euthanasia is being legalized across the West. And as we've seen in Canada and increasingly in the Netherlands, it's been basically aggressively prosecuted upon the disabled. While we can say that this moral relevance, as I've been trying to say, is only for very particular kinds of the disabled, this is not something that people can actually neatly chop up in my mind. This is one for keeping within philosophy. I think it's true. I don't think we should do worse than we currently do to the babies and the disabled. The babies. 2 babies. None of this really seems worth the cost for me. Or is something which could ever plausibly happen. Generalized vegetarianism is a much easier moral proposition to deal with in practical terms, even if it's instinctively rejected. There's no need to retreat on any moral worth for any sort of being, and rather people would get to advance that, what they likely think would be the proper value of their pets. There's a practical sense where, of course, ridding ourselves of meat eating is very, very difficult. I mean, it's a bit silly to say that it's not. There is a practical sense. It's completely the case. It's entirely and completely the case that ridding ourselves of the eating of meat is a far more difficult proposal. But I would suggest it is a simpler one in a moral sense. We need only extend our circle of concern to animals that we regard as possible friends. In the chat, we have learned that Sam Badger has a Substack, which he posts upon, and it's apparently good. He's been positively called out by Ben Burgess and Varn. So it sounds like it would actually be good. And you can see the link in the chat. It's just Sam Badger at substack.com. If there is a view in this debate that I totally and emphatically reject, it is anti-speciesism. This is not a view which I can even possibly sympathize with. Well, in a very distant sense, I can sympathize with it. I can sympathize it in the sense that the people who hold it, I believe, are highly empathetic individuals who are genuine, or trying to be genuine about their beliefs. They're trying to be genuine about a certain, I don't want to say humanism because they wouldn't like to say humanism, but you know, they are almost moral saints, these sorts of people, but at the same time are completely and utterly wrong. And I think fundamentally the biggest problem I would have with anti-speciesism is that it falls to the exact same problems as meat eating if you try and take it seriously. That since moral concern surely must stop somewhere, but it's not clear what justification there is to ever stop if one is anti-speciesist. You end up in the opposite situation. Instead of eating baby brains, you end up not being able to justify killing bacteria and killing viruses. You would think a serious anti-speciesist would commit to, being against vaccines. And of course, you can make a distinction and say, oh, I'm an anti-speciesist in the sense that I only care about animals that can feel pain, even in a very distant sense. Certain insects show significant reactions to some kind of pain sense. I would include all of those. And that's fine, but in that case, you're not being anti-speciesist. You're being anti-painist or whatever. Rather, and I think clearly and utterly, we should be speciesist. And it's through being speciesist, it's through being actually thinking through the capacities that various animal species have, that we would end up being able to guarantee rights to animals. Because while there are no real substantive distinctions between friend animals and prey animals, there are clear distinctions between species or groups of species, or however you'd like to say it. There is, of course, a sliding scale, and we aren't that informed about which animal places at which point, but the fact that we aren't fully informed at the moment, and it's hard to make distinctions, and it's a sliding scale where you have to make a cutoff at definitive points, these are problems. But these are problems which are widespread in various fields. And none of this stops us from being able to make broad distinctions and investigating the edge cases on a scientific, moral basis. The ability to feel pain, the ability to express some form of autonomous expression of a set of preferences seems to me to be the most relevant capacities here, and thus the relevant rights are these same ones. Chris Oslin says, what about the idea of needing to kill yourself what you eat? I learned that Chris is an elf. Chris grew up centuries ago on a farm in the Midwest where we raised hogs, chickens, cows, etc. I would go to farms in summer, and when I was in Syria, I was in an environment where we directly slaughter animals, but I just don't really think it makes a moral distinction. The only kind of moral distinction is that, there's a limit on how quick you can engage in this slaughter. You can't kind of forget and distance itself from them. So you probably, as someone who's engaged in this, who's killed animals in this way, you're more morally informed. You're more informed about the nature of animals, and all of this is positive. But that doesn't actually change the moral status of killing the animals. It just means that you have a greater capacity to decide, to understand what the actual moral capacities of these animals are and whether they are morally relevant or not morally relevant. Chris says, just fucking old. Yeah, I mean, you're an elf. You grew up centuries ago. Of course you're old. The right as regarding pain and pleasure is the obvious right that we would give animals. We should not hurt a feeling animal, and we should do our best to treat them decently. In a more broad sense, we should act to make sure that the lives of animals that live globally are better. This would mean likely abolishing animal slaughter and perhaps also animal agriculture. The latter is theoretically entirely possible. I don't agree with the written. I think it's probably completely justifiable to continue with animal agriculture in terms of what vegans object to. But that we would first need to abolish capitalism in order for these things to be engaged with in a reasonable way. Notably, however, this means there will also certainly be a large decline in global animal numbers, which, if you're a utilitarian which cares about animals, is a problem, but otherwise it's not. Chris says, I myself agree with you, Stefan, about this view I often encounter. Yeah, I often encounter it. I think it's part of the mess of common views you'll encounter when you talk to people about this kind of stuff, but one which doesn't really have any moral substance to it. As I said, I think it makes you better and morally informed, but doesn't actually change the nature of the killing. But, and I think this is not discussed very often, I think this view would also mean taking various interventions to uplift the lives of animals that are not directly under human administration, such as the distribution of vaccines to wild animals and so on for wasting diseases and the like. The restraint on this, beyond the question of how much human focus should be on this business, because it's better for humans to focus on humans because we still have a higher moral value. The other half of the question then goes into the question of autonomy and preference. Soon asks, how would we feed our pet cars? We're about to discuss pet cars. Oh, were you not making a pet car joke about Americans? Are you actually saying, were you meant to write pet cat? I'll read out the next bit and we can get back to it. One of the most interesting moral distinctions I've found between American and British people, and Americans, you can now say, actually, that's not true. We don't believe in this. But I've been led to believe that Americans think it's immoral to let a cat outside, like freely outside, not under human administration or direction. While British people think it would be immoral to not let a cat outside. This, I have the impression, is something that Americans take deadly seriously. They are concerned both with the tyranny of the car, because cars in America just go around slaughtering a great deal of people and things and animals and so on, and the problem with wild animals within certain regions of America, and this is in 2 states. The question of things killing the cat, which is only relevant in most places in America with the car, but also otherwise in certain rural regions. But more importantly, because of the things killed by the cat, there's an idea, quite reasonable one, that cats go about slaughtering other animals. Which brings us to a thorny issue. Should predation be abolished? Would it be for the best that natural predation, the killing of other animals by other animals, the killing of animals by other animals for the sake of food, should that be something that we should intervene to abolish? I'm of the opinion no, though whether this is rationally, morally defensible is another matter. I think it's certainly aesthetically justifiable. But whether it's morally justifiable is another question. There's only one real defense of the continuation of predation. And I accidentally went off my document. I don't take seriously the idea that predation is necessary for the ecosystem. Rather, this only possible defense is that autonomy and the expression of preference, and more broadly, the idea that the broad realization of certain kinds of being being able to engage in their being in the world, of certain kinds of being, is valuable in of itself. How bad is predation? How much predation is there? Not as bad as you may think straightforwardly, but still clearly bad. Few animals die from predation in the grand scheme of things. Few animals are eaten. Well, few animals, I think more animals are eaten. Few animals are killed by being eaten. And their deaths otherwise are often severely unpleasant, especially those foisted upon them by the other sort of invisible predator of disease from bacteria and so on. But nevertheless, it is bad to be eaten. And rarely are they killed cleanly or swiftly. Being eaten while you remain hanging on to life is not something which is uncommon in the natural environment. The defense of this such as it is that the nature of certain beings to predate, is that it is the nature of certain beings to predate upon others, and there's a value in the nature of beings being able to express, being able to sort. There is value in there being different categories of being who express different kind of being in the world. And the question we would ask then is the species being of any particular species or class of species, such as predator, something that's worth preserving, even if it causes suffering? I believe yes, but it's not clear where the break is here between aesthetic and moral value. That the cat is able to prosecute upon the world in a manner befitting a cat would seem to be of the highest aesthetic value as regarding the cat. Of course, I understand that my perspective here is not particularly common. Few see the highest value in a cat when it's killing something, and are rarely pleased when the cat returns after the kill with its dead thing in play. I very much am. Seeing a cat at work in this sense is my greatest pleasure vis-a-vis the cat. But I understand that even saying that can seem quite sociopathic, even if, of course, we are all animal slaughterers ourselves, indirectly. But the idea that a lion should be allowed to kill is something that all normies will think. But this is in large part because it's seen as utterly essential to the lion to continue to be able to do so. Presumably, we could entirely free the cat from predation through direct or indirect intervention, through behavioral changes, through feeding them fake meat and so on. Of course, you'd see if it's possible for humans to eat a full vegan diet, then presumably it's possible for most animals. It's just something that would be hugely expensive and something which is not necessarily we are orientated towards understanding exactly what we'd have to give these animals and what things we'd have to produce. So the question is, on the matter of predation, should we intervene immensely into the lion so that it is no longer a predator, or would be doing so something that would entirely erase the value of the lion, such that there's no need, such they would make the entire thing pointless, and we should instead leave the lion to predate? Arlo says, I have to personally been able to eat all the animals. Everyone else can't be a predator, though. I think that is often a justification given in the case of eating animals, where it's like, if you consider that I want to, though. It is interesting. I think of anything, the eating of meat is the one which most people, obviously because it's very personal, right? If meat eating is wrong, and seriously wrong, then we're all in a lot of trouble, morally, maybe. We're all plausibly in a lot of trouble, because it's not like an easy boundary. It's not like a thing of where like people point out that you shouldn't be using gay as a pejorative. Where you're like, okay, I understand that, and all that's being said about you is that you've been insulting. But if we make the step into saying it's bad to kill animals, you're like, okay, then I'm a mass murderer. Sad. Soon says, and they're being repeatedly autocorrected from cat to car. My girlfriend's cars are too lazy to slaughter anything but the whiskers. Yeah, of course there are some cats who could probably be very easily made into non-predators. You would just feed them vegan protein mix, and even if you let them outside, they wouldn't bother to slaughter anything because they're too lazy. If anyone has any questions, I've finished reading the essay or the whatever you would call it. So if anyone has any questions or just wants to blather on about something and get me to react to it, say in chat. Also, if anyone has any recommendations for the next fantasy novel I should read. Addison says there was a medieval Muslim who was vegan by modern standards. I think he said since animals punish each other in nature, they know justice and deserve rights. Huh. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly kind of related to the demandingness objection, which is the idea in utilitarianism that you produce a situation where it seems like in utilitarianism, if we have the view that anyone that's not maximizing utility is immoral, then everyone is always being maximally immoral. Well, not maximally immoral. There is like sliding scales of being immoral, but everyone is being immoral. And the most moral people are still being almost entirely immoral. And this counts as an objection against utilitarianism, because we have an understanding of how morality should work, where there are good people and bad people and so on. And this is so completely away from the intuitive view that there is a concern about whether it's actually talking about the right things. This is a relatively similar situation, but one which I don't think falls prey to the same problem, because while it's very intuitive that meaning is right, this is just like an end result normative view. It's not the view of a normative moral system. We're not trying to work out which normative moral system is the best, but rather based on various moral systems, we're trying to make an accounting of what moral actions are right or wrong. In this case, something like veganism is subservient to these ideas. I think that's really correct at the end about how most people don't even think about whether it's moral to eat as many animals as you please. Most of the carnivore humans act strange when they do. I mean, to be clear, I do eat meat. I didn't for many years, but that's only because I go along with the even more probably bizarre and strange views around newborn babies and disabled, which I discussed, which I don't really want to go into details about because they just seem completely insane. And because for the reasons I've already outlined, I don't really want people to agree with me, even if I think I'm right, because I think they will use this sort of views to suggest things which would make the world worse. I don't like that. So there's obviously a thing here where StreamYard will show the comments on screen, but it's still really small. So like I really hate that. Like StreamYard will make my face really small without an option to make it bigger, and it'll also make this thing in the bottom right of the screen way too small. Like I'm really annoyed at StreamYard. Yeah, so obviously utilitarians will come back on this. Certainly Sock said, unfortunately, the drowning child thought experiment and the points Singer makes there show that even our basic moral intuitions are very demanding, and we ought to strive to live basically sanely. Well, it's interesting there because what Singer draws out there is, yes, we are willing to spend $300 in order to avoid a child dying. But if that child is far away, we don't have the same intuition. And then you make the completely rational and justifiable point that it doesn't matter the location of a child. Like the location of a child in space in relation to you seems morally irrelevant unless that implies that you can't do anything for them. In our contemporary world, you probably can do something for a child that's very far away from you. As I'm sure people are aware, as they're constantly at the moment being confronted with appeals from Gaza. Chris said, my hair is not quite as long as Stefan, but my beard is much grayer. And you shave. Toussaint asks, hello Toussaint, why draw the line at meat? Why not include dairy, eggs, and honey too, which vegans also object to? In terms of harm, there are some similar amounts of suffering. I would suggest that, and I think I have said. Yeah, I mean, I went back and forth on it. I think I was probably a bit vague. But in our present moral conditions under capitalism, these industries are heavily exploitative, unjustifiably exploitative. There is a bit of a chicken and the egg situation. Forgive the analogy. Where it's not clear whether we have any chance of abolishing these industries before we get to socialism. And then when we're in socialism, it seems plausible that we could have moral institutions which engage in animal agriculture for dairy, eggs, and honey, which would also have the added benefit of meaning there are more sheep and chickens and so on in the world. I was about to say cow. Oh no, yeah, cows make milk. I'm stupid. Yeah, so there would be also the possibility of increasing the population in a more justifiable way of these animals if we could engage in animal agriculture with them. Ashley said, it's not our place to place judgment on the natural world and manipulate it further. I could not disagree more. And I think there's also probably no way to justify distinction between the natural world and the human world or whatever. We're all completely, like, humans are not alien from the natural world. We're all in it together. Lady Braga says, great combo, thanks. Animal rights make me think a lot about how we think we're different from non-human animals. This is an interesting one. I have seen people that are vegetarian or vegan making arguments or making suggestions that it might be that for similar reasons to why it might be wrong to eat animals, it might be wrong to eat plants. And that's an interesting one because it makes me more confident in the idea that they're wrong about animals. That animals don't fundamentally aren't morally relevant, or at least a larger amount of animals are not morally relevant. Because they will make analogous arguments between plants and animals. But I'm fundamentally 100% confident that plants are morally irrelevant. So if someone makes an argument from an analogy involving plants, that works backwards on me, where it doesn't make me care more about the plant, it makes me care less about the animal. Not really. There's some like very vague suggestions. I think around broccoli, of all things, around like tree networks. That there's a kind of interconnectedness. But I think the thing with plants, unless I'm wrong, is none of them have like a central reprocessing point, and nothing like a central reprocessing point. Animal species generally have something like a brain, or at least some kind of central nervous system, even if they don't fully have what we'd understand to be a brain. But from what I remember, plants are much more horizontal. They don't have any central reprocessing place where decisions are kind of taken up. Dogs are people. I hope not. Because if so, we are not doing right to them. Yeah, I mean, again, it's this thing of like, and I think I understand why vegans, real vegans and vegetarians get annoyed here, because you'll kind of say, they'll say, it's wrong to engage in this mass animal agriculture. And then you'll come up with these reasons to be like, well, there's like what 0.0001% of how animals are slaughtered is actually morally acceptable. To which they must think, oh my, you fucking like, it's 100 billion animals being killed every year in mass animal agriculture. Who cares about this contrived scenario you're making up? while it's still being correct that yes, I don't think there is anything wrong with the scenario that Soon's outlining here, apart from how it could lead to knock-on effects where it changes how we would relate to these animals otherwise. I don't think this can be justified. Sam says, I just like eating calamari because squids think it's okay to eat squid. They're cannibalistic. It seems to project our morality on them. I mean, this is just like saying that like it's fine to eat humans because some humans are cannibalistic. Like, it's not just that like a squid is mistaken about morality. They've got no concept of morality at all. Of course, like there are non-human animals that engage in rape and so on. This doesn't make me. Well, I'm not even going to continue that line of thought, but you can imagine the two ways it could branch off there. I don't think there's any reason to countenance any idea here that just because a certain thing engages in a failing, it's fine to engage in that failing as regarding that thing. People are dogs. God is a dog. I think the most hardcore sort of animal rights activists are often comfortable with having pets, especially kind of, I think, having dogs. I think dogs are so obviously biddable and human centric in their behavior that I think like hardcore animal rights people can be uncomfortable keeping them. Yeah, I mean that's fine because it's good as you and Chris have done to bring up these views, which people will often say, where as regarding animals, which don't really necessarily make very much sense, even if you don't actually believe in them, because these are views that people will commonly put about. If dogs are people, then is it wrong that Cuba is my emotional support Canadian? Did I take an American dog's job and give it to a foreigner? I think luckily that's something you'll have to work out between the two of you. Toussaint's going to have to pay $100,000 for the H-1B visa for Cuba to be their emotional support Canadian. Oh, anyone else got any? Oh, I was going to ask. Did I already ask this? What fantasy novel I should read next? This week, recently, this week I did read Curse of Chalion, which is very good. Even if it was like the plot, it was funny one where you can like think up 50 objections to it, then you're like 10 out of 10. The plot was pretty trite. It wasn't my kind of story, my kind of vibe. The magic stuff was like weird. It was in a traditional like patriarchal setting. The writing, like the prose, wasn't that rich or descriptive. But it just had a really, really well written main character in like a quite comfy, interesting, aristocratic world. And kind of the line to line stuff, which is very good at drawing you in and drawing you in. Such as I gave it one of my very rare distinctions, which is a 5-star rating on Goodreads. And we're in the very rare situation where I'm two 5 stars in a row. Curse of Chalion. I might not be pronouncing that right. If we go on my Goodreads, I don't think you can't look at my Goodreads. It's like private to me, I think. Maybe. Uh, oh. Can you guys go on that? Does that work? Does that link work? Don't eat animals. Most of them are cute one way or another. Reasonable perspective. But yes, I read Curse of Chalian. I also read The Thief as a remedy, which wasn't very good. I mean, it wasn't. It was fine. It was quite good. I've realized I've linked that, and actually, Curse of Chalian's on like page 5. It's like the oldest added book on there. But yeah, I read that, and before that, I read The Raven Scholar, which was also a 5-star experience, even though it's a one where, I mean, the main thing about that was there was a character whose what happened to them was so crushingly sad that I thought about it on the bus like a week later and got really sad for like 45 minutes. And not like a fun sad. Like you can have a sadness which is like enjoyable, like the one that'll make you cry and high emotion, this kind of stuff. This was just like a grim, dark, almost anxious sadness, produced by this text. So I'm looking for a new book to read. I assume because no one has said anything in the chat, they don't have any immediate suggestions, which is fine. Don't even know how many people here read fantasy, and I'm sure they'll work it out on my own. But yes, unless anyone has any killer book suggestions, I will move to end the stream. I was just thinking during the show that I might do next week on whataboutism, because Ben just replied to that Zionist woman, the trans one. The Zionist lady was saying, "Ooh, no one cares about this siege in Sudan because they don't get to insult the Jews that aren't there or whatever, general Zionist nonsense." And also like the most vapid kind of whataboutism, as obviously I do know people who pay attention to this siege in Sudan. I know quite a lot about the siege in Sudan. I'm not. I mean, I guess I am concerned about it in a distant sense. I just don't get really emotionally concerned about news events. But it is interesting, I think, because I do engage in things. I do engage in things which could be called whataboutism, but I think there are some cases of what is described as whataboutism which are justified, and others which are clearly unjustified, but there isn't necessarily, I think, a good schema out there to adjudicate between them. So I might be doing that. Well, Chris is watching from Osaka. He's not only a 300-year elf, but he's also watching it like 4 a.m. Or maybe he's so far ahead that he's almost at a reasonable time again. Askell Sanders Moss. It's so depressing, it's almost funny again. Arlo has read A Witch's Guide to Burning. Sam, you are correct that it was Brianna Wu. I don't think I gave My Space Marine Lover 5 stars. Maybe next week soon can just come on the pod and roast my Goodreads reviews. I'm currently reading Lord of the Rings out to my mother, so I'm not allowed to just finish it myself. Yeah, there's certainly cases where it is relevant to bring up another case. I think basically the contradiction or the tension will be around where someone is like, X is bad, and you're like, well, Y is bad. And pointing out Y is bad is relevant, such as the case that they're assuming that you think Y isn't bad. And what someone like Brianna Wu is doing is she's trying to, work upon the sense that you don't talk about what's happening in Sudan, which is very bad. But of course, the people who aren't talking about Sudan, if they learned about Sudan, if they learned about the siege of al-Fasher, they would think it's really bad. They just don't pay much attention to it because of this kind of structure of media environment it is. But if you went to anyone and said, is what's happening to al-Fasher bad? And you explain it to them, even though it's not being prosecuted by the IDF, people will be like, yeah, obviously that's bad. Cool. I'll knock off for the day. Thank you, Soon. Thank you, Soon, for thanking me. Thanks, Toussaint, for being in the chat. Thanks for everyone else being in the chat. Bye. What about them? Next week, probably. Yeah, and as Sam Badger says, we didn't arm every side in the Sudan war. The reason that lots of people don't pay attention to Sudan is there isn't a Western-backed government there.